Hi students, I'm Praveen Sebastian Paul. In this lecture, we are discussing the emergency management interventions during disasters. There are three types of pre-impact interventions that can affect the reduction in disaster impacts. Hazard mitigation and emergency preparedness practices directly reduce a disaster's physical impact and indirectly reduce its social impact, whereas recovery preparedness practices directly reduce a disaster's social impact. Improvised disaster response action also directly affect disaster's physical impact, but by their very nature are likely to be much less effective than planned interventions. Similarly, improvised recovery assistance directly affect disaster's social impact but is likely to be less effective than systematic recovery preparedness practices. When we come to the hazard mitigation practices, one way to reduce the physical impact of disaster is to adopt hazard mitigation practices. These can be defined as pre-impact actions that protect passively against casualty and damage at the time of hazard impact. Hazard mitigation includes hazard source control, community protection work, land use practices, building construction practices, and building content protection. Hazard source control act directly on the hazard agent to reduce its magnitude or duration. For example, patching a hole in the leaking tank truck prevent gas from being released. Community protection work, which limit the impact of hazard agent on an entire community, include dams and levees that protect against floodwater and seawall that protect against storm surge. Land use practices reduce hazard vulnerability by avoiding construction in areas that are susceptible to hazard impact. The use of the term land use practices instead of land use regulation is deliberate. Landowners can adopt sustainable practices where or not they are required to do so. Thus, government agencies can encourage the adoption of appropriate land use practices by providing incentives to encourage development in safe location, establishing sanctions to prevent development in hazardous location, or engaging in risk communication to inform landowners about the risk and benefits of development in location throughout the community. Hazard mitigation can also be achieved through building construction practices that make individual structures less vulnerable to natural hazards. Here too, the use of the term building construction practices rather than building code is deliberate because building owner can adopt hazard resistant design and construction material in the absence of government interventions. When we come to the emergency preparedness practices, another way to reduce a disaster's physical impact is to adopt emergency preparedness practice, which are pre-impact action that provide the human and material resource needed to support active response at the time of hazard impact. The first step in emergency preparedness is to use community hazard or vulnerability analysis to identify the emergency response demands that must be met by performing four basic emergency response functions, that is emergency assessment, hazard operation, population protection, and incident management. The emergency assessment consists of actions that define the potential scope of the disaster impact, whereas hazard operation consists of short-term action to protect the property through expedient hazard mitigation action initiated during an emergency. Population protection action protect the people from impact, and the incident management action activate and coordinate the emergency response. The next step is to determine which community organization will be responsible for accomplishing each function. Once the functional responsibility have been assigned, each organization must develop procedures for accomplishing those functions. Finally, the organizations must acquire response resources to implement their plan, and they need to maintain preparedness for emergency response through continued planning, training, drills, and exercise. When we come to the recovery preparedness practices, just as emergency preparedness practice are pre-impact action intended to develop the human and material resource needed to support an active emergency response, recovery preparedness practices are pre-impact actions that are intended to develop the financial and material resource needed to support for prompt and effective disaster recovery. First of all, household and business need to prepare for disaster recovery by purchasing hazard insurance because this will provide the money they need to rebuild damaged structure and replace destroyed contents. However, hazard insurance varies significantly in its availability and cost. Moreover, some ethnic group cannot afford the rate of high quality insurance company or are denied coverage altogether. In addition, the government or hazard prone community need to prepare for action includes impact assessment, debris management, infrastructure restoration, housing recovery, economical recovery, and linkage to hazard mitigation. It seems to be common thought that the development of disaster recovery operation plan can be delayed until after disaster strikes, but practitioners and researchers agree that community disaster recovery is faster and more effective when it is based on a plan that has been developed prior to the disaster impact. There are 6 important features for pre impact ROPs. Firstly, it should define a disaster recovery organization. Second, it should identify the location of temporary housing because resolving this issue can cause conflict that delay consideration of longer term issue for permanent housing and distract policymakers altogether from hazard mitigation. Thirdly, the plan should indicate how to accomplish essential tasks such as damage assessment, condemnation, debris removal and disposal, rezoning, infrastructure restoration, temporary repair permits, development moratoria, and permit processing because all of these tasks must be addressed before the reconstruction of permanent housing can begin. Fourthly, pre-impact recovery plan also should address the licensing and monitoring of the contractors and retail price control to ensure victims are not exploited, and also should address the jurisdiction, administrative power and resources, especially the level of staffing that is available. It is almost inevitable that local government will have insufficient staff to perform critical recovery tasks such as damage assessment and building permit processing. So, the arrangement should be made to borrow staff from other jurisdictions and to use trained volunteers such as local engineers, architects, and planners. The fifth point is that these plans also need to address the way in which a recovery task will be implemented at historical sites. Finally, the sixth point is a pre impact recovery plan should recognize the recovery period as a unique time to enact political and hazard mitigation and make provisions for incorporating this objective into recovery planning process. So my dear students, in this lecture we had discussed the emergency management interventions during disaster. So dear student, kindly go through this assignment question. The question is, write in detail about hazard mitigation practices, emergency preparedness practices, and recovery preparedness practices of the emergency disaster management interventions. So my dear students, In the upcoming lecture, we will discuss the conducting community hazard vulnerability analysis. So, see you soon. Until then, goodbye. Thank you, and all the best.